Welcome to episode 1 of the American Experiment podcast. I'm John Hinderaker, and I'm joined by David Zimmer. David served for 33 years in the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office before coming to American Experiment as a policy fellow. David, I want to ask you about this brand new report that we have published literally this morning about alleged racial bias in Minnesota's criminal justice system. But maybe first by way of background, a lot of this goes back, this idea was out there before, but a lot of it goes back to 2020. We had the George Floyd incident, and the idea that Minnesota's law enforcement and criminal justice systems are biased against black people was everywhere, not just in Minnesota, but around the country, even internationally. What was it like for you as working in law enforcement at that time? Did you see that narrative at work here in Minnesota?
Well, I certainly saw the narrative at work, and I can just tell you it was demoralizing to work in that atmosphere post-Floyd. But I saw the narrative in effect really beginning in the 2010s, I think, and I can go into that some more.
Yeah, where do you think it came from, or how did you first become aware of it?
Well, after years of declining crime rates in the early 2010s, we had, I would say, reformists viewed that we had things under control with our crime, and they decided, let's start picking at some of the issues that have long bothered them. And so there's this narrative that because there's a disproportionate level of black involvement in the criminal justice system, that's evidence that the criminal justice system was unfairly treating blacks. And so I wanted to take a look at that, take a look at the data to see if the data actually supports that narrative.
Let's talk about that, David. So when people say that law enforcement and criminal justice are biased against black people, what they usually do is to compare the number of blacks who get arrested, prosecuted, convicted, incarcerated against the percentage of blacks in the general population. And obviously you do find some disproportion there. What's wrong with that approach?
Well, like you just mentioned, when you use the general population, this massive amount of people in the denominator of this, basic mathematic calculation, you're bound to come up with disproportionate numbers. And what I did, and what I was fortunate to be able to do, is use a new data set, and that is the criminal offenders by race. That just became available through the BCA in 2021. I think we're one of the first groups that has used that data in some analysis. And in using this new data set, it provides for a far more focused look at how are people actually being treated within the criminal justice system.
So let's talk about that data set. First of all, you mentioned the BCA, that's the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension here in Minnesota.
That's right.
And so they put out a variety of statistics on crime, right?
Yes.
And so what they have recently done, and they did it for the year 2021, is they put out statistics on offenders, that is, who's committing various types of crimes by race. Is that right?
Right.
And so that enabled you to look at the number of blacks, whites, whatever, who are being arrested and say, okay, fine, how does that compare to the number who are committing the crime?
Right.
Per the BCA's numbers. Is that the basic idea?
Yep. It allowed us to focus the examination on who's committing the crime, not this broad general population, because 98% of white Minnesotans and 85% of black Minnesotans are completely law-abiding. So to use that huge law-abiding population in the calculation is misleading.
So how does the BCA know, if they want to know who's committing robberies, who's committing murders, whatever it may be, where do they get that information?
Good question. So it comes predominantly from victim and witness identification, which takes all of the bias out of things in general. If you look at arrest data, which was in the past kind of that initial data that you could use to start making some of this analysis. That the criticism has always been, well, that's fraught with police bias. Police are targeting people, and so you can't really rely on that as an accurate depiction of who's committing the crime. Now we have, with this offender data coming from victims and witnesses and people picking up the phone to call 911, it's taking that police bias, if you will, out of the equation.
And presumably when someone has just been victimized, robbed, raped, assaulted, and they describe the perpetrator to the police, they're going to describe him correctly because they want him to get caught.
Exactly.
Right? So that's a very reliable source of information. So what did you find? If you kind of look at the big picture, when you look at this new data from the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, crime by crime, broken down by race, what does that show you?
Well, it shows us that black Minnesotans are committing offenses at a disproportionate rate to white offenders, really a grossly disproportionate rate. I broke it down into a variety of areas here, and I started with creating a data set called serious crimes. So I evaluated murder, assault, robbery, weapons crimes, drug-related crimes, and rape. And then I took that data set and followed it all the way through the system to arrests, to charges, and to incarceration. And I also dug down deep into the weeds on things like sentencing departures and that kind of thing. But to begin with, the offender data really just shows that, unfortunately, black Minnesotans are committing a disproportionate amount of the crime in Minnesota.
And if we look at the serious crimes together, what do you mean by disproportionate? How disproportionate?
So the data shows that black Minnesotans are 10 times more likely to be serious crime offenders, 50 times more likely to be a murder offender, 16 times more likely to be an assault offender, and the one that really sticks out is robbery, 107 to 1 more likely to be a robbery offender.
And when you say more likely, that's on a per capita basis?
Per capita basis, yeah.
So that's really extraordinary. So the starting point isn't really the arrest or the prosecution or the conviction. The starting point really is the crime.
Yep.
And so you start with the crime and you say, well, we've got, in Minnesota, if you look at serious crimes altogether, black Minnesotans per capita committing 10 times the rate of serious crimes as white Minnesotans.
Right.
That's the bottom line. Well, then let's move on to arrests. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with at the crime level. Now some of these crimes hopefully get solved and followed by an arrest. What do you see with the arrest data?
Well, and that's where some of the concern comes in, because if the narrative was accurate, that the system was systemically racist and biased and treating offenders differently based on their race, well, you would see this offender data even worsen as blacks traveled through the criminal justice system. And actually, we see the opposite.
Yeah, if there was bias, and if it's 10x at the crime level,
Right.
well, then you look for 20x, 30x, 40x, something like that as you work through the system. Right?
Exactly.
What do you see instead?
Well, instead, we see things kind of flip on their ear here. So for serious crime arrests, white offenders, and now we move into offenders and not per capita, and that's the importance of this analysis, is now we're focusing on who the offenders are. So white offenders are 1.6 times more likely to be arrested than black serious offenders. And all across the board, that's the case. If you look at the crime of murder, white murder offenders are 1.5 times more likely to be arrested. Assaults, 1.5 times more likely to be arrested. Robbery, now if you remember, robbery was that huge 107 times more likely for black offenders. White offenders are 3 times more likely to be arrested for robbery. So now I know it's on a per capita basis. The offender data is based on per capita basis. But when you get into the offender data, white offenders are 3 times more likely to be arrested for
So that's
robbery.
really interesting. So if you've got a white robber and a black robber, the white robber is 3 times as likely to get arrested.
That's right.
And in all these crime categories, whether it's the murder, whether it's assault, whatever it might be, the white criminal is more likely to get arrested than the black criminal.
With one exception. I found that weapons-related offenses weighted more heavily towards black offenders. So black offenders were 1.3 times more likely to be arrested for a weapons-related crime.
Okay. So after the arrest, I guess the next step is the prosecution. And did you continue following these numbers through the whole criminal justice system?
Yes. So I made a number of data practices requests to a number of different entities. And for charges and prosecution, I went to the Minnesota District Court and got their data. It's grouped slightly different than the BCA data and the sentencing guideline data, but I was able to piece it together and make sure that I had a good faith effort to be comparing apples to apples. So I found with charges, again, that trend that white offenders were treated more certainly and more sternly in the system, followed through in the charges. So for serious crimes, white offenders were 1.8 times more likely to be charged with a serious crime. Murder, 1.9 times more likely. And similar to the arrests, black offenders were 1.2 times more likely to be charged with a weapons offense.
So I guess what comes next? You got the charge, I guess, and then you have a trial, and most of these guys get convicted. What comes next?
Right. Again, the trend continued in the pronouncement of prison sentences. So once a trial occurred or a plea was given, the judge sentences the defendant to either prison or a stay. So this data came from the Sentencing Guideline Commission, and I was able to use those exact data sets that I've been comparing all of this against. And again, the trend continued. So for serious offenders, white offenders were 1.5 times more likely to receive a pronounced prison sentence in 2021.
So basically, it's really interesting, David, as you work your way through the criminal justice system, you see the same thing at each level, essentially.
Right.
I mean, the numbers obviously are going to be slightly different, but basically you're seeing the same pattern. You're not seeing any sign of a bias against this body of black offenders.
Certainly not, and especially when you go back to the disproportionate offender levels. There is, that did not follow through, and in fact, it kind of turned on its ear throughout the system.
So what comes next?
So I started getting down into the weeds here a little just to see if there was any part of the system that was, maybe disparately affecting black offenders. And I didn't find much. I looked at presumptive versus actual prison commitments. So a presumptive commitment is what the judge is presumed to have to sentence a defendant to based on the sentencing guidelines. And what I found is that white serious offenders were 1.4 times more likely to receive a presumptive prison commitment. And then I looked at actual prison commitment because a judge can depart from that presumption. And actual commitments actually increased. So whites were 1.5 times more likely to receive an actual prison sentence than their black counterparts. I looked into the departures like we just mentioned, and there are 2 types of departures. There's a dispositional departure, which means the disposition of either prison or a stay of prison. And then there's a durational departure, which means the amount of time that the judge sentences a defendant to.
It's like 3 years instead of 5 years.
Right, right. So based on the sentencing guidelines, judges departed almost exactly the same. There's a 1% difference between white and black for dispositional departures. So again, prison or not prison. And whites were just 1%, 1.01 times more likely to get a dispositional departure downward. But in the durational departure category, blacks received a durational departure downward 1.66 times. They were 1.66 times more likely to receive a downward departure on the amount of time they served.
So when you talk about bias in the criminal justice system, one of the things that you'll hear about is, well, look at the prisons. The prisons are full of black men. And in a number that certainly is greater than their percentage in the population, no doubt about that. We all know that's true. And you also looked at that, right? I mean, who is in prison, currently incarcerated, and how does that relate back to who started out by committing the crime?
So I did take a look at the incarceration rates for those sentenced in 2021, and I looked at 3 different categories: those receiving a prison sentence, those receiving a local commitment, so to a jail or a workhouse, and then a category of total confinement or total incarceration. And in each of those categories, the data shows that white serious offenders are more likely to receive all forms of incarceration. So 2.1 times more likely to receive local confinement, 1.5 times more likely to receive a prison sentence, and overall 1.9 times more likely to receive total incarceration.
And I think you've got the numbers in here somewhere, David. I don't remember what they are, but I believe that there are, in fact, more whites in prison in Minnesota than blacks. Is that right?
There are, but again, like we've noted, I am not disputing that there is a disproportionate number of blacks in the system. What I'm disputing is the narrative that the system created that disproportionate.
Yeah, sure. The question is why.
Right.
And then you've got one last set of charts in your paper. This paper is a great piece of work, by the way, David. And it's one of the beauty of it is that really it's simplicity. I mean, the concept of what you've done here is very simple to understand. It's very simple to explain. That doesn't mean it was easy to do.
No.
You had to track down a lot of data from different data sources, line it up to make sure you're comparing apples, all the way through it. I watched you do this. I know it took a lot of work. And when you get done, the conclusions are clear and they seem pretty simple.
Right. The challenge for me is to take all of that work I did and boil it down into, digestible sound bites. So charts 8 and 9 near the end of the report deal with going back to the offenders per capita. And again, we make no dispute that there is a 10-to-1 ratio of black offenders to white offenders, and the data shows that clearly.
On a per capita basis.
Per capita in 2021. But what's interesting is who's in prison, and it almost mirrors that exactly, which is what we should expect. So at the end of 2022, a report came out January 1st, 2023, the Minnesota prison population had a ratio black to white of 9.6 to 1 black to white, which is...
Again, per capita.
Per capita, yep.
So at the end of the whole process, the proportion of the people who are in prison exactly the same, or almost exactly the same,
right,
as the proportion who started out committing serious crimes.
Right.
Which is what you would expect from a fair system.
Exactly.
David, let's talk about drugs for a moment, because kind of a subset of this whole narrative about racial policing, racial bias, has to do with drugs. And we saw this even in the last session of the Minnesota legislature talking about marijuana. And there's an idea out there that drug enforcement has been racially biased, that it's disproportionately impacted blacks and accounts for a big proportion of incarceration. What did you find? Did you analyze that? And if so, what did you find?
Yeah, we certainly did, and we can pretty much blow that myth apart. Again, if you start at the offender data set, we found that black Minnesotans were 5 times more likely to be drug offenders than whites, but then that disproportion flipped on its ear as you moved through the system. So for arrests, white offenders were 1.2 times more likely to be arrested. White offenders were 1.8 times more likely to be charged. White offenders were 2 times more likely to receive a prison sentence. And I looked into the actual data of who's in prison for drug crimes. And the narrative out there is that our prison is full of low-level drug users, predominantly marijuana users, and predominantly people of color. The fact is, and the DOC fact sheet,
DOC, Department of Corrections.
Department of Corrections fact sheet spells this out clearly. They currently house 25 non-white defendants or inmates for marijuana crimes. And I can tell you from experience, that is not user amounts of marijuana. We're talking hundreds of pounds.
Nobody is going to prison for smoking a joint.
Nobody is. And also interesting in that fact sheet is they spell out what is the largest group, drug-related group in prison, and it is those that have committed methamphetamine-related crimes. And there's about 1,000 prisoners out of 8,500 there for meth-related crimes. Of that, 75%, so about 750 inmates are there that are white. So white defendants made up the 75% of all meth-related convictions and prison sentences.
So, David, there's another part of your report here that I think is really important, and that's victimization. You know, all of the proposals that we see for so-called reform, you know, criminal justice reform, law enforcement reform, almost all these proposals, what they really amount to is scaling back, having less law enforcement, you know, fewer prosecutions, fewer arrests, less incarceration. And talk about that. What's the impact of that? Who gets hurt by that?
Well, sadly, the groups that get hurt the most are the groups that reformists are claiming they're trying to help. And so specific to this analysis, we're looking at adult blacks and adult whites in the criminal justice system. What I found is that black Minnesotans were victimized 9.5 times, almost 10 times the rate of white Minnesotans. So by depolicing and limiting enforcement in, for example, black communities, what we're actually creating is more crime. And those very communities that we're trying to help are bearing the burden of increased crime.
So that 10-to-1 disproportion, again, on a per capita basis of black offenders, again, is almost exactly mirrored in who are the victims.
Right.
You know, it's almost 10-to-1 preponderance, again, per capita of black victims. And they're the real losers in this story, aren't they? If we follow through on this hysteria about let's have less policing, less law enforcement.
They certainly are. And from my experience on the street, I still believe there's a strong silent majority within the black community that does not buy into this narrative and does not support the activist voice out there that is clamoring for less enforcement. I can cite many examples following up on shootings and other crimes of violence where people, when the police were on scene, people would come out of their house in droves and ask for more enforcement and be supportive of the police. But you don't see that in the media. All you see is the activist voice saying police are over-policing these neighborhoods, and that's what's causing the problem.
I'll bet you never had people in these black neighborhoods coming up to you and saying, "Go away." I'm guessing what you saw was people saying, "Please help us."
The 85% of the law-abiding people, yes. That's it.
Okay, got to make that distinction.
Right.
Yeah. Well, David Zimmer, I think this is a great piece of work. The title is Dispelling the Myth of Unwarranted Racial Disparities in Minnesota's Criminal Justice System. I hope we're going to be able to give it a huge amount of publicity. I think it's a really important corrective to a lot of misinformation, really faulty logic, faulty analysis that has been out there, and has had some real consequences in the world that I think have been very, very unfortunate. We should mention too, David, that your article is excerpted in a shorter form in the current issue of Thinking Minnesota. So the 100,000 or so people who get Thinking Minnesota, be sure to look for it, read it. It's a really important piece of work.
Great.
So thank you very much, David. And with that, we will end episode 1 of the American Experiment Podcast.